The gunshot echoed through the valley like thunder, stopping Xavier Ellsworth dead in his tracks. Blood trickled down his arm as he dove behind a large boulder, the bullet having merely grazed him. The stage robbery had gone terribly wrong, and now he was on the run, in a territory where the law was unforgiving and justice swift. Xavier had never planned to be an outlaw. At 26, with broad shoulders from years of ranch work and eyes the color of the Montana sky, he had simply fallen in with the wrong crowd after his family's farm was foreclosed. One bad decision had led to another, culminating in this disastrous robbery attempt, where two of his companions lay dead and the third had abandoned him. The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory was still wild and untamed. Xavier knew he couldn't return to the settlements nearby. His face would be on wanted posters by sundown. With nothing but the clothes on his back, a revolver with 4 bullets remaining, and a small pouch of food, he headed north, away from civilization and deeper into the unknown. For 3 days, Xavier traveled across the rugged landscape, sleeping under the stars and surviving on jerky and wild berries. His wound had begun to fester, and fever set in as infection spread through his body. On the 4th morning, barely able to stand, he spotted a small homestead in the distance, a modest cabin, with smoke rising from the chimney, surrounded by fields of wheat and corn. Desperation drove him forward. He needed help, even if it meant risking capture. As he staggered toward the cabin, his vision blurred, and the world tilted beneath his feet. The last thing Xavier saw before collapsing was a slender figure rushing toward him, her honey blonde hair catching the morning light like a halo. When Xavier opened his eyes, he found himself lying on a straw mattress inside a small but tidy cabin. The throbbing in his arm had subsided, and clean bandages wrapped his wound. Confusion clouded his mind as he tried to piece together how he had arrived there. "You're awake." A soft voice drew his attention to a young woman standing by the hearth, stirring something in a cast-iron pot that filled the cabin with a savory aroma. "I was beginning to worry." She turned to face him, and Xavier felt his breath catch. She couldn't have been more than 22, with clear green eyes and a face that somehow managed to look both delicate and strong at once. Her simple calico dress and apron spoke of a practical nature, but there was something in her expression, a quiet determination, that immediately commanded his respect. "Name's Zara Blackett," she said, approaching with a cup of water. "You've been out for nearly 2 days." Xavier tried to sit up, but winced as pain shot through his arm. "Xavier Ellsworth," he replied, deciding in that moment not to fabricate a false identity. Something about this woman made him want to be honest, despite the danger. "I'm much obliged for your help, Miss Blackett." "Mrs.," she corrected, helping him drink. "Though not for some time now. My husband Thomas died of typhoid last winter." Xavier nodded solemnly. Death was a common companion on the frontier. "I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry to impose on you like this. Once I'm able, I'll be on my way." Zara studied him with those penetrating green eyes. "That infection nearly killed you, Mr. Ellsworth. You won't be going anywhere for at least a week." She returned to the hearth. "Besides, I could use the help around here once you're mended. Can't manage all these fields alone forever." Xavier felt a mixture of relief and unease. He was grateful for the sanctuary, but worried his presence would bring trouble to this widow's doorstep. Still, as he watched her move confidently around the small cabin, he couldn't help but admire her self-sufficiency. "You live out here all alone?" he asked, taking in the modest but well-kept interior of the cabin. "Just me and Promise," she replied, gesturing toward the window, where Xavier could see a chestnut mare grazing. "And the chickens, I suppose?" A faint smile touched her lips. "It's quiet, but it's mine. Thomas and I came out here 3 years ago from Pennsylvania. He had big dreams for this place." Xavier nodded, understanding the pull of the frontier. "It's good land," he commented, having noticed the fertile fields surrounding the cabin during his approach. "Good enough," Zara agreed, pouring some broth into a wooden bowl. "Here, you need to eat something." As the days passed, Xavier's strength gradually returned. True to his word, as soon as he could stand without dizziness, he began helping around the homestead. He fixed the leaky roof, mended fences, and chopped enough firewood to last through the coming winter. All the while, he kept his past to himself, though the guilt of his deception weighed heavily on him. Zara asked few questions about where he'd come from or how he'd been injured. She seemed content with his presence and the help he provided. Each morning, she would change his bandages with gentle hands, her fingers occasionally lingering longer than necessary, though neither acknowledged the growing tension between them. One evening, as summer waned and the first hint of autumn colored the horizon, Xavier found Zara staring at a small patch of wildflowers near the edge of her property. The setting sun bathed her in golden light, and for a moment he forgot his troubled past and the uncertain future that awaited him. "They were Thomas's favorite," she said without turning, sensing his presence. "He used to say they reminded him that beauty could grow anywhere, even in the harshest places." Xavier stepped beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Zara confirmed, a wistfulness in her voice. "But he wasn't made for this life. The frontier broke him bit by bit, the isolation, the constant struggle. By the end, I think he would have gone back east if he could have." She turned to Xavier, her gaze direct. "What about you, Mr. Ellsworth? What made you come out this way?" The moment of truth had arrived. Xavier looked into her trusting eyes and knew he couldn't continue his deception. "I wasn't always a ranch hand, Miss Zara. The truth is, I've done things I'm not proud of." He told her everything about his family's farm, the foreclosure, the desperate choices that led him to robbery, and the fateful day that brought him, wounded and hunted, to her doorstep. Throughout his confession, Zara's expression remained impassive, giving no hint of her thoughts. When he finished, silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of his revelations. "I understand if you want me to leave," Xavier said finally, bracing himself for her rejection. Zara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "My father was a thief," she said at last. "He stole to feed us after my mother died. Eventually they caught him and hanged him in the town square." Her voice was steady, matter of fact. "I learned young that good people sometimes do bad things when they're desperate." She turned to face him fully. "I don't condone what you did, Xavier, but I believe people deserve second chances. This land, it's about new beginnings. That's why we all came out here, isn't it?" Relief washed over Xavier, along with a surge of admiration for this remarkable woman. "Thank you," he said simply, unable to express the depth of his gratitude with mere words. As summer gave way to autumn, Xavier and Zara fell into a comfortable routine. He worked the fields from dawn till sunset, throwing himself into the physical labor as if to atone for his past misdeeds. She kept the household running, preparing hearty meals that restored his strength and spirit. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes sharing comfortable silence. Xavier found himself watching Zara when she wasn't looking, the way her hands moved deftly as she kneaded bread, how she hummed softly to herself while hanging laundry, the rare but beautiful sound of her laughter when something amused her. He began to realize that his feelings for her had grown beyond gratitude or friendship, but he kept them carefully hidden, believing he had no right to such feelings, given his past and her recent widowhood. The harvest season arrived, bringing with it long days of backbreaking work. Together, they brought in the wheat and corn, storing provisions for the winter ahead. Xavier marveled at Zara's strength and determination. She worked alongside him without complaint, her face glowing with satisfaction as they filled the small barn with the fruits of their labor. "We did well," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Better than I could have managed alone." Xavier nodded, acutely aware of how close she sat to him, their shoulders nearly touching. "It's good land," he repeated his earlier assessment, "and you work it well." Zara turned to look at him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "Will you stay for the winter, Xavier?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. "I know you probably plan to move on, but—" She hesitated, her eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. "I've grown accustomed to having you here." The question caught him off guard. He had indeed been thinking about moving on, perhaps heading further west, where no one would know his face or his past. But the thought of leaving Zara alone on this isolated homestead, especially as winter approached with its brutal storms and long, dark nights, troubled him deeply. "If you'll have me," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd be honored to stay." A smile spread across Zara's face, transforming her features and making Xavier's heart race. "Good," she said simply, returning her gaze to the sunset. After a moment, her hand found his on the rough wooden bench between them, her fingers intertwining with his. They sat that way until darkness fell, neither speaking of the line they had just crossed. Winter came early that year, bringing with it bitter winds and heavy snow that isolated the homestead from the nearest settlement, some 15 miles away. Xavier had reinforced the cabin and outbuildings in preparation, ensuring they were as weathertight as possible. He had also constructed a covered walkway between the cabin and the barn, allowing them to tend to the animals without trudging through deep snowdrifts. The confinement of winter brought Zara and Xavier closer. With less outdoor work to occupy their days, they spent more time together inside the small cabin. Zara taught Xavier to read better, using her small collection of books, while he entertained her with stories of the various places he'd traveled and people he'd met during his wandering years. One night, as a blizzard howled outside, they sat close to the fire playing a game of checkers on a board Xavier had carved from spare pieces of wood. Zara had just claimed victory for the third time that evening, her competitive streak shining through as she gloated good-naturedly. "I think you're letting me win," she accused, her eyes bright with amusement. Xavier laughed, holding up his hands in surrender. "I wouldn't dare. You're simply better than me at this game of strategy, Mrs. Blackett." "Zara," she corrected him, her smile softening. "After all these months, I think you can call me Zara." "Zara," he repeated, savoring her name. The firelight danced across her features, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheekbone and the fullness of her lips. Without thinking, Xavier reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her skin. Zara's breath caught, and for a moment, they remained frozen in that tableau, his hand against her face, her wide eyes locked with his. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, she turned her face into his palm, pressing a soft kiss against his callous skin. The simple gesture sent a jolt through Xavier's body. "Zara," he whispered, her name a question and a plea all at once. Rising from her chair, Zara moved around the small table until she stood before him. With gentle hands, she framed his face, tilting it upward to meet her gaze. "I never expected to feel this way again," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire and howling wind. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of me died too." Xavier stood, bringing himself to his full height, still holding her gaze. "I have nothing to offer you," he said, honesty compelling him to state the hard truth. "I'm a wanted man, with no property, no prospects. You deserve better." "I deserve to choose," Zara replied firmly, her hand sliding down to rest on his chest. "And I choose you, Xavier Ellsworth, past and all." When their lips finally met, it was like coming home after a long journey. Xavier gathered her in his arms, pouring all his unspoken feelings into the kiss, his admiration, his gratitude, and the love that had grown steadily over the months they had spent together. Zara responded with equal fervor, her body melting against his as if she had been waiting for this moment just as desperately as he had. That night, in the small bed they now shared, Xavier and Zara forged a new beginning amidst the howling winter storm. Their coming together was both tender and passionate, a physical expression of the emotional bond that had formed between them. Afterward, as Zara slept peacefully in his arms, Xavier stared at the ceiling, overwhelmed by the turn his life had taken, and determined to be worthy of the trust she had placed in him. As winter gave way to spring, Xavier and Zara's relationship deepened. They worked side by side, preparing for the planting season, expanding the fields, and making improvements to the homestead. Xavier built a new chicken coop and dug a better well closer to the cabin. He also constructed a small workshop, where he began crafting furniture in his spare time, discovering a talent for woodworking he hadn't known he possessed. In town, rumors circulated about the widow Blackett and her mysterious farmhand. Some whispered that she had taken a lover, while others suggested they had secretly married. Zara paid little attention to the gossip, holding her head high when they made their infrequent trips to purchase supplies or sell excess produce. Xavier, however, remained vigilant, always alert for signs that his past had caught up with him. He grew a beard and kept his hat pulled low when they ventured into town, aware that his face might still adorn wanted posters in some territories. The constant fear of discovery cast a shadow over his happiness, a reminder that their idyllic life together existed on borrowed time. One warm afternoon in late spring, as Xavier worked in the south field, he spotted a dust cloud on the horizon, riders approaching the homestead. His heart raced as he dropped his tools and ran toward the cabin, where Zara was preparing the midday meal. "Riders coming," he said tersely as he burst through the door. 4, maybe 5 of them." Zara's eyes widened with alarm. Visitors were rare in this isolated area, and a group that size usually meant trouble. "The sheriff?" she asked, understanding his fear. Xavier shook his head. "Can't tell yet." He moved to the corner where his rifle stood propped against the wall, checking that it was loaded. "Stay inside. If it's the law, I'll surrender peacefully. I don't want any trouble coming to you because of me." "No," Zara protested, gripping his arm. "We face this together. Whatever it is." The determination in her eyes brooked no argument. Xavier nodded reluctantly, and together they stepped onto the porch to await the approaching riders. As the group drew nearer, Xavier's tension eased slightly. These weren't lawmen, they lacked the organized appearance of a posse. Instead, they looked like ordinary travelers, albeit heavily armed ones. Still, he kept his hand close to his holstered revolver as the riders pulled up in front of the cabin. The lead rider, a grizzled man with a thick gray beard, tipped his hat to Zara. "Afternoon, madam. Name's Harlan Meeks. My companions and I were looking for a place to rest our horses and maybe purchase some food if you can spare it." Xavier studied the men carefully. There was something about them that set his instincts on edge, a hardness in their eyes that spoke of violence. "You're a long way from the main trail," he observed, keeping his tone neutral. Meeks shrugged. "Got some business in these parts. Private business." His gaze shifted between Xavier and Zara, assessing their relationship. "This your husband, madam?" Before Zara could respond, Xavier stepped slightly forward. "Xavier Ellsworth," he introduced himself, intentionally using his real name to gauge their reaction. "I work this land with Mrs. Blackett." If the name meant anything to Meeks or his companions, they didn't show it. Zara, following Xavier's lead, nodded politely. "You're welcome to water your horses at our well," she said, gesturing to the structure Xavier had built. "I can spare some bread and stew if you're hungry." The men dismounted, and Xavier maintained a watchful eye as they watered their horses. Something about their demeanor suggested they weren't simple travelers. The way they continuously scanned the surroundings, the manner in which they positioned themselves with clear sight lines, these were men accustomed to trouble. Inside the cabin, Zara prepared a simple meal while Xavier engaged Meeks in careful conversation, trying to determine their true purpose. The other men remained mostly silent, eating the food Zara provided with mumbled thanks. "Fine place you have here," Meeks commented, his gaze wandering around the cabin's interior. "Bit isolated, though." "Don't you worry about outlaws and such?" "We manage," Xavier replied evenly. "Not much here to interest outlaws." Meeks chuckled. "You'd be surprised what interests some men." His eyes lingered on Zara as she cleared the dishes, and Xavier felt a surge of protective anger. As the men prepared to leave, one of the younger riders pulled Meeks aside, speaking in hushed tones while glancing repeatedly at Xavier. A cold dread settled in Xavier's stomach. Something had been recognized, some connection made. Meeks approached Xavier as he stood by the door, his expression now guarded. "You know, you look mighty familiar, Mr. Ellsworth. Ever spend time up Montana way?" Xavier maintained a neutral expression despite his racing heart. "Passed through once or twice. Never stayed long." Meeks nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Well, we appreciate your hospitality. Might be, we'll pass this way again." The implied threat wasn't lost on Xavier. As the riders disappeared down the trail, he turned to Zara, his decision already made. "I have to leave," he said quietly. "They recognized me. If they come back, it'll be with the law." Zara's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "Then we leave together." "Zara." "No," she interrupted, taking his hands in hers. "This land means nothing without you. We'll go somewhere new, somewhere they won't find us. Colorado, maybe, or further west to Oregon. We can start fresh." Xavier looked around the cabin she had built with her husband, at the life she had carved out of this wilderness. "You'd leave all this? For me?" Zara smiled, the certainty in her eyes humbling him. "This is just a place, Xavier. Home is wherever we're together." That night, they made hurried preparations. They couldn't take much, just what would fit in the small wagon Zara had used to bring supplies from town. Clothes, essential tools, seeds for planting, and a few cherished possessions. Xavier helped Zara bury her wedding ring and a lock of Thomas's hair beneath the wildflower patch, a final goodbye to her first love. They departed before dawn, leaving the chickens loose and opening the corral so the milk cow could forage. Zara didn't look back as they drove away from the homestead, her gaze fixed firmly on the western horizon where their future lay. Xavier, however, glanced repeatedly over his shoulder, half expecting to see Meeks and his men in pursuit. Their journey west was arduous. Spring rains had turned many trails to mud, slowing their progress. They avoided towns and settlements when possible, camping in secluded locations and keeping to themselves. When they did need to venture into civilization for supplies, Zara would go alone, while Xavier remained with the wagon, his beard now fuller and his hair longer, changing his appearance from the man on the wanted posters. One evening, as they camped beside a small creek in western Wyoming Territory, Zara approached Xavier with an idea that had been forming in her mind. "I think we should be married," she said without preamble, sitting beside him on a fallen log. Xavier looked up from the rabbit he was skinning for their dinner, surprise evident on his face. "Married?" Zara nodded, her expression earnest. "It would be safer. A married couple attracts less attention than whatever people might think we are now. And—" She hesitated, a rare vulnerability showing through her usual confidence. "And I want to be your wife, Xavier, properly, before God and anyone else who matters." Xavier set aside his work and took her hands in his, unmindful of the blood that stained his fingers. "Zara Blackett, I would be honored to be your husband, but are you certain? I'm still a wanted man. That might never change." "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied, squeezing his hands. "We'll find a way to make a life together, no matter what." 2 days later, they encountered a small trading post nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges. The elderly proprietor, Samuel Jenkins, and his wife Martha welcomed them warmly. When Zara explained they were looking to get married, Martha's face lit up with delight. "Well now, ain't that fortunate?" she exclaimed. "Pastor William stops by every third Sunday to hold services for folks in these parts. That's tomorrow. He can marry you proper." And so, on a sunny Sunday morning in June 1877, Xavier Ellsworth and Zara Blackett were married in a simple ceremony outside the trading post. Pastor Williams, a circuit preacher who asked few questions and seemed more concerned with the condition of their souls than their pasts, performed the service with genuine warmth. Samuel and Martha Jenkins served as witnesses, along with a few trappers and a family of settlers who had stopped at the trading post. Zara wore her best dress, freshly washed in the creek and adorned with wildflowers she had gathered that morning. Xavier had shaved his beard and trimmed his hair, wanting to look respectable for his bride. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Zara with such tenderness that Martha Jenkins dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. That night, in the small room, the Jenkins had insisted on providing for the newlyweds. Xavier and Zara consummated their marriage with a passion born of deep love and the shared understanding that they had committed to facing whatever the future held together. "Mrs. Ellsworth," Xavier murmured against Zara's hair as they lay entwined in the narrow bed. "Has a nice sound to it." Zara smiled in the darkness, her hand tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "It does indeed, Mr. Ellsworth, though I suspect we'll need to be careful about using that name too publicly." Xavier sighed, the reality of their situation intruding on their happiness. "Perhaps we should consider a different name altogether. A fresh start." "Perhaps," Zara agreed. "But tonight, I'm Zara Ellsworth, and that's all that matters." The following morning, as they prepared to continue their journey, Samuel Jenkins approached Xavier with a proposition. "Got word from a friend up north," he said, keeping his voice low. "Homestead available in a valley about 100 miles from here. Previous owner died this winter. No family to claim it. Cabin still standing, fields already cleared. Could be had for a fair price, especially for newlyweds looking to settle." Xavier exchanged a glance with Zara, hope kindling in both their eyes. "How far from the nearest town?" he asked, practical concerns at the forefront of his mind. "Day's ride in good weather," Jenkins replied. "Far enough for privacy. Close enough if you need supplies or a doctor. Folks thereabouts mind their own business, if you take my meaning. It seemed too good to be true, a ready-made homestead in an area where questions weren't asked and pasts weren't scrutinized." After a brief discussion, Xavier and Zara decided to investigate the opportunity. Jenkins provided them with crude but accurate directions, and they set off with renewed purpose. 4 days later, they crested a hill and saw the valley spread before them, a patchwork of meadows and forests, with a small creek winding through its center. Near the northern edge, partially sheltered by a stand of pines, stood a modest cabin with outbuildings. "It's perfect," Zara breathed, her hand finding Xavier's as they surveyed what could become their new home. The cabin was weather-beaten but sound, needing only minor repairs to make it fully habitable. The previous owner, an elderly trapper named Elias Corbin, had maintained the property well before his passing. His simple grave, marked by a wooden cross, stood beneath a large oak tree behind the cabin, a somber reminder of the frontier's harsh realities. Through Samuel Jenkins's friend, a transaction was arranged. Using money Zara had brought from selling her previous homestead's crops, supplemented by funds Xavier had saved from odd jobs during their journey, they purchased the property. To avoid using the Ellsworth name on official documents, they registered the land under the name Wilson, Zara's mother's maiden name. By midsummer, they had settled into their new home and begun the work of preparing the land for the next growing season. Xavier repaired the cabin's roof, built new furniture, and expanded the small barn to accommodate additional livestock they hoped to acquire. Zara planted a kitchen garden, preserved wild berries from the surrounding forest, and transformed the cabin's interior into a warm, inviting home. In the nearest settlement, a growing town called Pine Creek, they presented themselves as James and Elizabeth Wilson, newly arrived from the east. They kept their visits infrequent and their interactions cordial but reserved, gradually earning acceptance without inviting scrutiny. One autumn evening, as Xavier returned from the fields after a long day of work, he found Zara waiting on the porch, her face glowing with a special kind of happiness. She had prepared his favorite meal, venison stew with dumplings, and set the table with their best dishes and a bunch of late wildflowers in a jar. "What's the occasion?" Xavier asked, washing up at the basin by the door. Zara's smile widened as she took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly, her eyes shining with joyful tears. "Next spring, if my counting is correct." Xavier stared at her in wonder, emotions overwhelming him. In all his imaginings of his future, he had never dared hope for this: a wife, a child, a true home. Drawing Zara into his arms, he held her close, his own eyes damp with happiness. "A baby," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Our baby." That winter was the happiest of their lives. Despite the isolation brought by heavy snowfall that sometimes kept them homebound for weeks, they spent the long evenings planning for the future, Xavier crafting a cradle from pine wood, while Zara sewed tiny garments from fabric they had purchased in town. They talked of names, of hopes for their child, of the life they would build together. As Zara's body changed with the growing life inside her, Xavier found himself falling even more deeply in love with his wife. He marveled at her strength and the serene joy she exuded, despite the discomforts of pregnancy. He took on more of the household chores, insisting she rest when she tired, though she often laughed at his protectiveness. "I'm with child, not made of glass," she would tease, even as she acquiesced to his concerns. The baby arrived on a clear April morning in 1878. After a night of labor that tested Zara's endurance and left Xavier feeling helpless and terrified. With no doctor or midwife available due to the spring thaw making the trails nearly impassable, they faced the birth alone, guided only by a manual on childbirth they had purchased months earlier and Zara's dim memories of assisting at her cousin's delivery years before. When their daughter finally entered the world, her lusty cries filled the cabin, bringing tears of relief and joy to both parents. They named her Hope Elizabeth Ellsworth Wilson, hope for the future they had found together, Elizabeth for their public identity, and Ellsworth secretly preserved in her middle name to honor her true heritage. "She's perfect," Xavier whispered, cradling his daughter in arms that suddenly seemed too large and rough for such a delicate treasure. "She has your eyes. And your stubborn chin," Zara added with a tired smile. "Heaven help us when she's older." As spring blossomed around their homestead, Xavier and Zara settled into parenthood with the same determination they had applied to building their new life. Hope thrived under their devoted care, growing stronger each day. Xavier would often work with her, cradled against his chest, singing old trail songs his own father had taught him, while Zara found she could accomplish most of her tasks with the baby, secured in a sling across her body. Their happiness, however, was not without shadows. Xavier still scanned the horizon whenever riders approached, his hand instinctively moving toward his revolver before he could stop himself. He avoided the growing number of strangers who passed through Pine Creek as the railroad expanded westward, fearing recognition. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake in a cold sweat from nightmares of being taken away from his family, of Zara and Hope left alone to face the world's hardships. Zara understood his fears without him having to voice them. She kept an ear open for news or rumors, particularly alert for any mention of robberies or outlaws from their former region. They had agreed long ago that if danger ever threatened, they would flee rather than stand their ground. Hope's safety was paramount. By the time Hope celebrated her second birthday, the Ellsworth Wilsons had established themselves as respected members of the scattered community. Xavier's skill with horses had become known, and neighbors occasionally brought animals for him to train or treat for ailments. Zara's preserves and baked goods were sought after at the small market that had sprung up in Pine Creek. Their farm prospered, allowing them to hire occasional help during harvest time, always transient workers who moved on quickly. One summer afternoon, as Xavier worked in the north field and Zara prepared supper in the cabin, a lone rider approached the homestead. Hope, now a curious toddler with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, spotted the visitor first from where she played in the yard. "Mama, horse!" she called excitedly, pointing down the trail. Zara stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the sun to identify the rider. A moment of tension gripped her until she recognized the familiar figure of Nathan Cooper, the postmaster from Pine Creek, who occasionally delivered mail to outlying farms when his route permitted. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wilson," Cooper called as he dismounted. "Got a letter for you. Came all the way from Pennsylvania, looks like." Zara accepted the envelope with surprise. She had severed all connections with her past life years ago, writing only a single letter to a childhood friend to let her know she was alive and well, but providing no details of her whereabouts. The return address on the envelope belonged to that same friend, Margaret Tanner. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper," Zara said, tucking the letter into her apron pocket. "Would you care for some lemonade before you continue on? It's a hot day for riding." Cooper accepted gratefully, and while he refreshed himself, he shared the latest news from town: a new schoolhouse being built, plans for a proper church, rumors of a gold strike in the mountains to the west. Zara listened politely, offering Hope a cookie to keep her occupied and casting occasional glances toward the field where Xavier worked, unaware of their visitor. After Cooper departed, Zara sat on the porch step with the unopened letter in her hands. Part of her feared what news it might contain. Perhaps Margaret had inadvertently revealed Zara's new life to someone who might connect her to Xavier. Taking a deep breath, she broke the seal and began to read. The letter contained startling news. Thomas's older brother William, whom Zara had never met, had been searching for her since learning of Thomas's death. He had finally tracked down Margaret, who had shared only that Zara had moved west. William had inherited a substantial sum from their uncle and, having no children of his own, wished to ensure that Thomas's widow was provided for. He had established a trust in Zara's name with the Merchants Bank of Philadelphia, accessible at any branch bank with proof of her identity. Zara read the letter twice, her mind racing with implications. The money would provide security for Hope's future, perhaps even allow them to expand their farm or move somewhere even more remote if necessary. But claiming it would mean connecting her past identity to her present one, a risk Xavier might consider too great. That evening, after Hope was asleep in her small bed in the corner of their room, Zara shared the letter with Xavier. He listened silently, his expression growing more troubled as she explained the unexpected inheritance. "It's a substantial sum," she concluded, "enough to ensure Hope's education, to see us through any hard times that might come. But I understand if you think it's too dangerous to claim." Xavier paced the small cabin, conflict evident in every line of his body. "When I was on the run, before I found you," he said finally, "I heard rumors that the charges against the gang were being reduced. The man who was killed during the robbery, it turns out he fired first. Self-defense changes things." Zara's eyes widened. "You never told me this." "Because it was just rumors," Xavier sighed. "And even if the charges were reduced, I still participated in a robbery. There would still be consequences." They discussed the matter deep into the night, weighing risks against benefits, fear against hope. By morning, they had reached a decision. Xavier would travel to Cheyenne, the territorial capital, to discreetly inquire about his legal status. If there was any possibility of resolving his past crimes through surrender, a reduced sentence, or even a pardon, he would pursue it. Hope deserved a father who could walk in the sunlight without fear, and Zara deserved a husband who wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder. The decision to separate, even temporarily, was painful. In the 5 years since Xavier had staggered wounded onto Zara's first homestead, they had rarely been apart for more than a day. As he prepared for the journey, Zara sewed extra shirts, packed food that would travel well, and tried to hide her anxiety beneath practical concerns. 2 weeks, Xavier promised, as he embraced her on the morning of his departure. "I'll be back in 2 weeks, no matter what I learn." Hope, not fully understanding why her father was leaving, clung to his leg with remarkable strength for such a small child. "Papa, stay," she insisted, her lower lip trembling. Xavier knelt to her level, gathering her into his arms. "Papa will come back, little one, I promise, and I'll bring you something special from the big town." As Xavier rode away, Zara stood on the porch with Hope in her arms, both of them waving until he disappeared from sight. The homestead felt immediately emptier, as if the heart had gone out of it. To keep their spirits up, Zara threw herself and Hope into projects harvesting the kitchen garden, preserving fruits, even starting on Christmas gifts, though the holiday was months away. In Cheyenne, Xavier proceeded cautiously. He adopted a slight accent and introduced himself as James Wilson, a rancher interested in purchasing property near the site of his former crimes. Through casual conversations in saloons and careful questions to court clerks, he pieced together the truth about his legal situation. The leader of the gang, Marcus Holloway, had been captured the previous year and, facing hanging, had confessed that the fatal shot during the robbery had indeed come from the guard, not from any of the robbers. The charges against the other participants had been reduced to attempted robbery and evading arrest, serious crimes, but not capital offenses. 2 of the gang members had already served their sentences and been released. Most significantly, the governor had issued a limited amnesty for certain non-violent crimes committed before 1877, part of an effort to bring order to the rapidly developing territory. If Xavier surrendered voluntarily, he would likely face a year in prison at most, possibly less with good behavior. The news left Xavier both relieved and conflicted. A year separated from Zara and Hope seemed unbearable, yet the prospect of finally being free of his past was powerfully tempting. He spent a restless night in a cheap hotel room, weighing his options and imagining Zara's reaction to each possible choice. By morning, his decision was made. He would return home, discuss everything with Zara, and they would decide together. If they chose surrender, they would need to prepare arranging for help on the farm during his absence, ensuring Zara and Hope would be financially secure, perhaps even moving closer to town, temporarily for safety. The journey home seemed interminable. Xavier pushed his horse harder than was wise, eager to share his discoveries with Zara and to see Hope's smiling face again. As he finally approached their valley, a sense of peace settled over him. Whatever they decided, they would face it together. The sight that greeted him as he crested the final hill nearly stopped his heart. 3 horses were tethered outside their cabin, unfamiliar horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, and he could see figures moving inside through the windows. Drawing his revolver, Xavier dismounted and approached cautiously, terror for his family's safety overriding all other concerns. He had nearly reached the porch when the door opened and Zara emerged, Hope balanced on her hip. Behind her stood a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive coat, a stranger. Xavier raised his revolver instinctively before recognizing the absence of fear in Zara's expression. "Xavier," she called, relief evident in her voice. "You're early. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." Confused but following her lead, Xavier holstered his weapon and climbed the porch steps. "Couldn't stay away from my girls any longer," he said, accepting Hope as she lunged from Zara's arms into his. "Who's our visitor?" The stranger stepped forward, extending his hand. "William Blackett," he introduced himself, "Thomas's brother. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but when I learned of Zara's whereabouts, I felt compelled to visit in person." Xavier's blood ran cold. This was Thomas's brother, the man who had established the trust fund, who had been searching for Zara. Had he somehow discovered Xavier's true identity? Was this a trap? Reading the concern in his eyes, Zara quickly intervened. "William arrived yesterday," she explained, her calm tone conveying reassurance. "He was passing through on business and decided to deliver the bank documents personally. Wasn't that thoughtful?" William nodded, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "I've been meaning to meet the man who's been taking such good care of my late brother's wife. The farm looks prosperous, and Little Hope is clearly thriving." Xavier forced himself to relax, to play the role of James Wilson, respectable farmer and family man. "We've been fortunate," he acknowledged. "Zara is an exceptional woman." The next few hours were an exercise in careful conversation. William seemed genuinely interested in their life, asking questions about the farm and their plans for Hope's education. He spoke fondly of Thomas, sharing stories from their childhood that brought both smiles and tears to Zara's eyes. Throughout the visit, Xavier remained vigilant, analyzing each question for hidden traps, each comment for signs of suspicion. By evening, however, he had to admit that William appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a successful businessman, with no hidden agenda beyond honoring his brother's memory by ensuring his widow and her new family were secure. When William presented the bank documents, explaining that the trust could be accessed at the Pine Creek Bank once it became an official branch the following month, his sincerity seemed genuine. After supper, as Hope played with wooden animals Xavier had carved for her, William pulled a small box from his coat pocket. "I brought something that I thought you might want," he said to Zara. "It belonged to Thomas's mother, my mother." Inside the box lay a delicate gold locket containing a miniature portrait of a handsome young man who bore a striking resemblance to William. "That's Thomas at 20, William explained. "Mother always kept it close to her heart. I thought perhaps Hope might like to have something of her, well, of Thomas." The moment hung heavy in the room. Xavier watched Zara's face, seeing the complex emotions that crossed it. Gratitude, sadness, and a momentary confusion about how to navigate this unexpected bridge between her past and present. "That's very kind," she said finally, accepting the box. "When Hope is older, she'll appreciate knowing about Thomas. He would have been a wonderful father." William stayed only one night, departing early the next morning with promises to visit again when business brought him west. After his departure, Xavier and Zara sat at their kitchen table, the bank documents and locket between them, finally able to speak freely. "I was terrified when I saw those horses," Xavier admitted. "I thought—" "I know," Zara reached across to take his hand. "But it's all right. William has no idea about your past. He believes exactly what everyone else does, that I'm a widow who found happiness with a good man named James Wilson." Xavier squeezed her hand, marveling at her strength and quick thinking. "Did he say anything about why he really came? It's a long journey just to deliver documents." Zara hesitated. I think he's lonely. He never married, devoted himself to the family business. Thomas was his only close family. In a way, Hope is his only connection to his brother, his family line. They fell silent, contemplating this unexpected complication in their carefully constructed life. Finally, Xavier shared his discoveries from Cheyenne, the reduced charges, the amnesty, the possibility of a short sentence that would finally clear his name. "A year," Zara repeated when he had finished. "They would take you away for a year." "At most," Xavier clarified. "Possibly less. And then I'd be free, Zara. Truly free. No more looking over my shoulder, no more fear every time a stranger approaches." He gazed at their daughter, playing contentedly on the floor nearby. Hope could know her father's real name. Tears welled in Zara's eyes, but she nodded slowly. "If you believe it's right, I'll support you. We'll manage while you're gone, and when you return, we'll start fresh. No more secrets, no more fear." The decision made, they spent the next month preparing. Xavier repaired everything he could think of around the homestead, hired a reliable young man from Pine Creek to help with the heavier work during his absence, and carefully documented all the farm operations for Zara's reference. Zara, meanwhile, preserved extra food, sewed new clothes for all of them, and worked with Xavier to create a detailed budget that would stretch their savings until his return. They told their neighbors that James Wilson was traveling east on family business, a half-truth that would explain his extended absence without raising suspicions. William Blackett, unwittingly helpful, had provided the perfect cover story with his unexpected visit and the inheritance he had brought. The hardest part was explaining to Hope. At 3, she understood only that her papa was going away for a long time. Xavier spent every possible moment with her in those final weeks, teaching her simple tasks, telling her stories, imprinting himself in her memory so she wouldn't forget him during their separation. The night before his planned departure for Cheyenne, Xavier sat on the edge of Hope's small bed, watching her sleep. Her dark lashes rested against her cheeks, her tiny hands clutching the rag doll he had helped her make. The thought of missing a year of her young life, of returning to find her, changed, grown, perhaps even hesitant with him, brought a physical pain to his chest. Zara found him there, silent tears tracking down his face. Without a word, she knelt beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. They remained that way for a long time, drawing strength from each other's presence, from the love that had sustained them through every challenge. "I don't know if I can do it," Xavier whispered finally. "Leave you both." Zara lifted her head to meet his gaze, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You can," she assured him, "because you'll be coming back to us. And when you do, you'll be Xavier Ellsworth in truth as well as in our hearts. No more hiding." The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day. Xavier dressed carefully in his best clothes, wanting to present himself respectfully to the authorities. Zara had packed his saddlebags with provisions for the journey, and a few personal items he would be allowed to keep during his incarceration. A Bible, a small photograph of Zara and Hope taken in Pine Creek the previous spring, and a lock of Hope's hair tied with a blue ribbon. Their goodbye was both agonizing and restrained, neither wanting to burden the other with the full weight of their emotions. Hope clung to Xavier, suddenly understanding that this departure was different from his usual trips to town or neighboring farms. "Papa come home soon?" she asked, her lower lip trembling as he set her down after a final embrace. Xavier knelt before her, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "Not very soon, little one, but I will come home. I promise you that. And every night you look at the stars and know that I'm looking at the same stars and thinking of you and Mama." As he mounted his horse, Xavier took one last look at his family, Zara standing tall and brave on the porch. Hope's small hand held firmly in hers. They were his whole world, his redemption, his reason for facing the consequences of his past, rather than continuing to run from them. "I love you," he called, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Both of you." "And we love you," Zara replied, her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering. "We'll be waiting." With that promise to sustain him, Xavier turned his horse toward Cheyenne and whatever justice awaited him there. The separation proved even more difficult than they had anticipated. For Zara, the physical challenges of managing the homestead alone were matched by the emotional strain of raising a child who constantly asked for her absent father. For Xavier, the stark reality of imprisonment, the loss of freedom, the harsh conditions, The separation from his family tested his resolve daily. Yet they endured. Zara wrote to Xavier weekly, her letters a lifeline connecting him to the world beyond the prison walls. She described Hope's growth, the changing seasons on their farm, the small triumphs and challenges of daily life. She never complained, though Xavier could read between the lines and understand the hardships she faced. Xavier's letters in return were treasures that Zara read repeatedly until the paper grew thin from handling. He wrote of his daily routine, of the other inmates who had become reluctant companions, of his plans for their future once he was released. Most importantly, he included special messages for Hope, simple stories, little drawings, promises of adventures they would share upon his return. True to the predictions, Xavier's sentence was indeed shorter than a year. 8 months after his surrender, he was released on good behavior, his debt to society deemed paid. The man who emerged from the territorial prison was leaner and grayer than the one who had entered it, but his eyes held a new peace. The burdens of his past finally lifted. The journey home was both urgent and measured. Xavier pushed himself to cover ground quickly, yet also found himself pausing occasionally, overwhelmed by the simple joy of freedom, the ability to choose his own path, to stop when he wished, to sleep beneath the stars without walls or bars constraining him. As he approached the familiar valley, his heart raced with anticipation and a touch of anxiety. How much had changed in his absence? Would Hope remember him? Would Zara still look at him with the same love? Or had the hardships of their separation dimmed her feelings? His fears dissolved the moment he crested the hill overlooking their homestead. Zara stood in the yard, hanging laundry on the line, her movements as graceful and purposeful as he remembered. Hope, noticeably taller now, was helping in her childish way, handing clothespins to her mother with serious concentration. It was Hope who spotted him first, her small body freezing as she stared at the approaching rider. Then, with a shriek that carried clearly across the distance, she dropped the clothespins and began running toward him, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner. "Papa! Papa, home!" Xavier practically fell from his horse in his haste to meet her, dropping to his knees as she launched herself into his arms. The solid weight of her, the smell of her hair, the strength of her small arms around his neck. It was everything he had dreamed of during the long nights of his confinement. "My Hope," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "My sweet girl." When he finally looked up, Zara stood before them, her eyes bright with unshed tears and her smile as radiant as the day he had married her. "Welcome home, Xavier Ellsworth," she said, using his full, real name for the first time in years, without fear or hesitation. Rising with Hope still in his arms, Xavier reached for his wife, pulling her into their embrace. "I'm home," he agreed, the simple words containing worlds of meaning. Finally, truly home. That evening, after Hope had been put to bed reluctantly, after extracting numerous promises that her father would still be there, when she woke Xavier and Zara sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, they savored the simple miracle of being together again. "What shall we do now?" Zara asked softly. "Continue as the Wilsons, or become the Ellsworths at last?" Xavier considered the question carefully. "I think perhaps it's time for James and Elizabeth Wilson to move on," he said finally. "People change their names out here for all sorts of reasons. No one would question it much if we became Xavier and Zara Ellsworth." "Anne Hope Elizabeth Ellsworth," Zara added with a smile, "her true name at last." "A new beginning," Xavier agreed, turning to kiss his wife beneath the vast Wyoming sky. Though some things will never change. In the years that followed, the Ellsworth family flourished. Their farm expanded, their reputation for honest dealing and hard work spreading throughout the region. Hope grew into a bright, spirited girl, with her mother's determination and her father's gentle heart. 2 more children joined the family, a son they named Thomas William, honoring both Zara's first husband and his brother, who had shown them such kindness, and another daughter, Grace, who arrived as a surprise blessing when they had thought their family complete. Xavier never entirely forgot the lessons of his past, but the weight of it no longer shadowed his days. Each morning, he worked the fields from dawn until sunset, finding honest satisfaction in the labor that provided for his family. Each evening he returned to find Zara waiting, supper prepared and quiet joy in her eyes at his safe return, a simple ritual that neither ever took for granted. Their love story had begun in desperation and deception, forged in the harsh realities of frontier life, but it had grown into something enduring and true, a testament to second chances, to courage, and to the healing power of love freely given and gratefully received. And so, as the 19th century drew to a close and a new era dawned on the American West, Xavier and Zara Ellsworth faced it together, no longer running from the past, but building a future filled with hope, grace, and the quiet joy of a love that had overcome every obstacle placed in its path.